She lifted her dress over her head and told the men to take her dress and give her their trousers for their cowardly behavior. She was a Kenyan woman from the Kikuyu tribe and she was on a mission. Her name was Mary Nyanjiru. Why was she taunting the men in such a rude way, you might ask? Here's the backstory. The British were colonizing the country now called Kenya. The British Empire had brought in hundreds of its people to settle in Kenya, and with it came all sorts of injustices and confusion. With it also came forced labor. Some Kenyans began to notice and raise their voices over this injustice. One such man was Harry Thuku. Harry Thuku had worked as a sweeper and a messenger for Standard Bank. He was also a typist for a settler newspaper called A Leader. After becoming increasingly aware of racism, Harry Thuku began to tour the rural areas. That is how Harry Thuku transformed himself into one of the pioneers in the development of modern African nationalism in Kenya. Back to the story. From about 1915, the colonial government began to force women and girls into forced labor. In his biography, Harry Thuku states that the tribal collaborators would often go to homes where there were pretty young girls. Those young girls would be compelled to go work for a settler, and the number of girls who became pregnant became very great. Edward Northey, who was then the governor in Kenya, claimed that the rape claims were exaggerated. One time in Nairi, Harry Thuku saw a couple of women who were cutting a large number of reeds under the supervision of tribal police. He immediately stopped it. He also hit out at 4 Kenyan collaborators, namely Karanja, Koinange Wambayo, Josiah Njonjo, and Waruhiu Wakangu. Harry Thuku claimed that they were for and not against young Kikuyu girls and women working on European plantations. Kikuyu women applauded Thuku's efforts to fight for them. Throughout Kikuyu-land, Thuku was known as Chief of Women. One lady called Wamboi stated the following: "We were brought to a coffee estate here. We were picking coffee and cultivating, and after 5 weeks we were given 30 shillings and no food. There was a man who was in charge of women. If he saw one part left uncultivated, he would beat you. A girl called Jerry was beaten and her leg broken. Because of his fight for women, Thuku had a whole lot of support from them. And following his increasing speaking out against the evil acts of the colonial government, including the attack on African culture by the missionaries, the Kiponda system and the hat tax, Thuku was arrested on March 14, 1922. The day following Thuku's arrest, a strike was called by the EA. Thousands peacefully marched to the Nairobi police station, where Thuku was being held. The strikers came to demonstrate and secure his release. After praying for Thuku's safety, the crowd dispersed. The following day things were different. A group of 6 men were chosen from the crowd and they met with Charles Boring, who was the colonial secretary. The group was assured that Thuku was in no danger and was only being detained while waiting for the government to grant him a full hearing. The group returned and told the crowd to disperse. When the crowd heard that, they began to slowly disperse, only for the women to begin taunting the men. Hearing this, the men who had started to disperse changed their minds and returned. It is then that Mary leapt to her feet, lifted her dress over her head and said, "Take my dress and give me your trousers. You men are cowards. What are you waiting for? Our leader is in there. Let's get him." The practice, that was barely used among the Kikuyu, indicated that the authority of men is no longer recognized in the situation. It is a huge deal, actually a curse in Kikuyu-land, to see women who are your mother's age naked. Needless to say, despite her bravery, Mary and several others were killed when police opened fire. Her bravery was captured 30 years later in a song that the Mau Mau freedom fighters would sing, and this would eventually lead to Kenya gaining independence in 1963.